So in Scotland, ESOL provision for displaced migrants is distinguished from ESOL provision in other parts of the UK for displaced migrants. The Scottish Government allows access for both asylum seekers and refugees, which is different to provision in England, and it also waives the fees for ESOL provision for asylum seekers and refugees in receipt of benefits. So this has resulted in a situation in Scotland where ESOL access isn't disaggregated by immigration status, and it can be accessed through three strands that we identify in our research. The first of these is through education, further education courses, so through college provision, which is funded by the Scottish Funding Council. The second of these is through local authority provision, so provision through community learning development partners, and also in some cases in post-16 secondary education. The third of these is community and third sector settings, so charities, voluntary groups, faith groups providing different types of ESOL. So across these three strands you get a huge range of ESOL types, and the environments are also very diverse in which they take place. So you get general ESOL, ESOL for employability, survival level ESOL across a number of different settings, delivered in formal settings or informal settings, and credited and non-accredited in different circumstances. So our findings from our research in Scotland, in a nutshell, say that the Scottish Government's approach to ESOL, which doesn't actively or formally exclude asylum seekers' access to ESOL provision, is to be commended. However, we also stress that more work could be done to actively address some of the informal barriers that displaced migrants experience in ESOL access. So stakeholders that we worked with reported that additional barriers to ESOL access for displaced migrants would include issues related to immigration controls. So if, for instance, an asylum seeker has to attend appointments with the Home Office, that may be disruptive to ESOL education. Issues related to experience of displacement, so issues related to trauma or health or mental health. Issues related to the local environment, so in Glasgow there are issues with ESOL waiting lists, for instance. There's also issues with the locations in which people are accommodated compared to where ESOL education takes place. And then issues related to educational and social background, so whether the level of literacy that people have in both English and in other languages. So talking to stakeholders reported that these additional barriers that displaced migrants might experience may result in a variety of experiences, possibly in combination. And this includes difficulties in accessing formal or informal ESOL provision if routes are not actively made accessible, disruption to ESOL attendance and then subsequently disruption to learning, requirements from different groups amongst asylum seekers and refugees for different types of learning. So literacy level learners may want different types of learning to people who have higher levels of literacy, and slower progression or different forms of progression, which sometimes can be difficult to formally evidence. The features in the ESOL landscape in Scotland that stakeholders picked out as potentially not actively addressing these issues or creating additional barriers as a result of these issues were first in further education, where there was good practice in some areas, in some locations and in some colleges, but in other colleges there weren't kind of full-scale steps to address some of the formal or informal barriers that displaced migrants experience. At the time of research, the SFC funding routes were undergoing quite a substantial amount of change, and stakeholders were concerned that this would affect funding routes, particularly for literacy level learners. We also did research outside of Glasgow in remote and rural areas, and their stakeholders reported concerns about the sustainability of ESOL provision in resettlement areas, particularly ones outside the central belt, and the role of further education in supporting resettlement ESOL beyond the end of the vulnerable persons resettlement scheme. And then related to that, stakeholders in remote and rural areas also reported issues in trying to access the expertise and resources that are available in the central belt. So on the back of that research, we came up with a number of recommendations which you can view in detail in our policy brief. But in a nutshell, they are. So we would suggest first for further work to be done with further education providers to improve the variety of informal barriers to ESOL education for displaced migrants. Second, to consider formal mechanisms for tracking progression for displaced migrants at literacy level ESOL and improve guidance about literacy level accreditation for practitioners. Third, to improve oversight of the role that colleges have in the distribution of ESOL resources, particularly in remote and rural resettlement areas where there perhaps isn't the precedent that you have in Glasgow. And finally, fourthly and finally, to address gaps in existing ESOL policy and knowledge about displaced migration.